we asked about what the biggest threats are in 2024, IR35, again at the top, above the recession.
And of the people that we surveyed, a concerning amount of people were actually questioning whether they wanted to continue in self-employment in 2024.
Yeah.
We had one party who brought in the original legislation. We then had another party who sought the reform in the public sector. The same party then sought reform in the private sector. The same party then sought a repeal for a very short period of time. So I can understand why actually most contractors are of the view none of these people represent what I actually do in the best possible way.
82% of engagers felt contractors were either critical or important for their business, which is quite nice, isn't it?
But realistically speaking, would IR35, a repeal of IR35 reform, ever be a contender for any political party in a new term?
Hi there, and welcome back to Your Own Account with Qdos. I'm Seb Maley.
I'm Nicole Slowey.
I'm Sam Cox.
And in this episode today, we thought we would have a bit of a talk about the recent annual survey that we released in January. So the annual survey is something that we do every year. And we had a really good response to it this year. So we feel like it's a pretty good barometer for what contractors have experienced, what they think about the situation at the moment, and also what their concerns are moving forward as well. So we thought it would be worthy of devoting some time to having a chat about it. Yeah. And I think one of the kind of headline statistics that we've taken from the survey is that 74.4% of contractors secured an outside IR35 contract in 2023, which is, on the face of it, pretty positive.
No, I mean, obviously we do need to temper certain views on it in terms of, this is very much a survey of clients who have interacted with Qdos, so there is that silent minority or majority that have struggled to source roles outside of IR35, but the fact that there are so many that are still engaged with Qdos and interacting with us on this basis and returning a result like 3/4 of them being, able to secure work outside of IR35 has to be taken as a positive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it just goes to show that after us being nearly at the point of 3 years post-reform, that lots of clients have actually got it right and that they are considering, and on a compliant basis, engaging contractors as outside of IR35. I think that the kind of important point to consider as part of it is, whilst 74.4% of contractors found an outside of IR35 role, they weren't necessarily easy to come by roles. And the competition for outside of IR35 roles, as you would expect, is really, really high.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show that actually there are clients out there across multiple sectors engaging workers on an outside of IR35 basis, and contractors can actually get access to those roles, which is a really, really positive kind of fact and kind of sentiment to recognise in the market as well.
Yeah. Would you say it's not quite a case of the tide turning? Is it more incremental than that? But
yeah, I think that's probably fair to say. I think it's an incremental change is probably what we would have expected, and I think it is just a case of waiting for certain dominoes to fall as well. There are certain industry sectors where, if not blanket determinations, but sort of broad strokes decisions being made around IR35 that will change at some point, and those are really going to move the needle, I think, in terms of these metrics going forward. And we've not really seen that over the last year, but those increments still count. They are moving the industry in the right direction from our perspective, and for contractors who are keen to engage outside of IR35. But also I thought it was interesting the view that we'd found in terms of the amount of blanket determinations that contractors still felt they were.
So that's 42.8% of contractors felt that they've been subject to a blanket determination.
Yeah,
which is quite high.
It is, and I mean maybe that's a terminology point. A blanket determination could be taken as to read, a uniform decision not to engage contractors. Yeah. That's different to a blanket determination. Yeah. But clearly the sentiment's the same there.
Yeah, and you mentioned the sort of the domino effect that we might see, with these people who have taken this kind of this stance of not engaging PSCs. What do you think will trigger first domino in that respect?
I think it will inevitably be one of the larger institutions, and let's take finance as the example there. If one of the larger banks were to change their stance on contractors, feeling emboldened by the results that businesses like Qdos have had in terms of handling those initial inquiries from HMRC, and if they view that as a reason to revisit that decision around IR35, clearly they will put themselves in a far superior position from a talent acquisition perspective. And from there, you would imagine a lot of other institutions would follow suit. It will differ from industry to industry, but I think that's probably how it would look.
And perhaps what we need is more compliance activity. Obviously we are seeing a lot of activity from HMRC at the moment in terms of kicking the tires of organisations and so on. We successfully closed one down last year. What we want to see is more of that. Yeah,
and I think that activity in organisations being able to demonstrate the fact that they've come out of the other side positively of any sort of HMRC inquiry or initial kind of question around their IR35 compliance will give other organisations confidence that actually that's an organisation like me. We use contractors in a similar way. Are there ways in which we can actually reconsider A, our policy decision, and B, where are the refinements that we can make to more positively assert that we are engaging contractors or can engage contractors on an outside of IR35 basis? So I think as we kind of go through the motions over the course of this year, where, like we said, we have a number of cases that we're working on at the minute where we would expect an element of progress to be kind of followed through on some of those, that the market in particular sectors can take that kind of vote of confidence and thinking of like reassessing their position. And I suppose the other thing as well is the continuation around challenges with access to skills is like simultaneously there as well. So I think a lot of organisations are kind of in the demand for talent, to your point around talent acquisition, that combined with, okay, we're actually seeing what the HMRC compliance approach to this is, we can manage it effectively, should hopefully push the needle a little bit further in a positive way as well.
I think so. I think the other side of it is if you actually look at the motivations for a lot of those changes, it wasn't necessarily the financial risk, it was the reputational damage that these businesses felt they could have by incorrectly engaging contractors. So actually that's, it lends itself to that argument quite heavily in the fact that, if there are multiple cases of contractors following an established process, engagers following a established process in terms of engaging with their contractors, then that really does, lend a credibility to operating outside of IR35 that was undermined by those reforms and effectively scared a lot of businesses into eschewing the outside of IR35 working full stop. So, it'll be interesting to see how it evolves over the next year, and comparing next year's survey results will be an interesting one to go through.
Yeah, so obviously it was, that it's a positive figure that 3/4 of people secured an outside IR35 role, but it's quite clear that IR35, from a contractor's point of view, still definitely poses the biggest risk when it comes to the successful performance of their business. So there's a couple of other statistics here. So only 17% of people rated 2023 as poor for business performance, which is positive. But the main factors there, IR35 reform featured at the top. Similarly, when we asked about what the biggest threats are in 2024, IR35 again at the top, above the recession, which obviously is, the recession, the economic conditions are having an impact on the job market at the moment. But ultimately, IR35 is clearly, the biggest issue for contractors.
Yeah, and I think it's probably not surprising that that's the case, because all routes for most contractors around thinking about their next contract, their next type of engagement, largely for most of them will be focusing on, okay, can I secure an outside of IR35 role? And finding clients who operate in that way is, like I said before, it's a challenge. Whilst we've got that really positive stat in terms of the number of workers who were able to secure a contract outside of IR35, I think most contractors across the board over the last few years have felt impacted and continue to be impacted in terms of either never been able to have secured an outside of IR35 role post-reform, or struggle that it's maybe every other contract is outside IR35. And I think the concepts of having your own limited company, thinking about working as an umbrella worker, thinking about going to some sort of agency PAYE structure, it's difficult because that represents a whole host of challenges as well. And I think contractors can see that it's still very much a live issue. Even though clients have established policies and whatnot, it is a live issue and it's affecting their ability to kind of make the progress that they otherwise might have made before in business in terms of the types of engagements, the types of contracts, or actually, from a contractor's perspective, even trying to work for the type of client that you want to work for and the type of project that you want to work for. Because I think one of the key things about all of this, and we've got some stats around it, is for contractors, it's not always about the money. It's not for financial related reasons that they go into contracting. It's the flexibility, the variety of work that they actually get, the type of clients that they get to work with as being key drivers for wanting to actually be self-employed in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. So again, that's one of the questions that we ask. Why do people like contracting? Why do they like freelancing? And I think you have this... there is often this kind of this line that contractors are in it for the money. They're tax dodgers, which couldn't be further from the truth really at the moment now. But obviously we asked that question, and the highest response was being their own boss. People like being in control of their destiny when it comes to from a business point of view.
I think that's always been an undercurrent in the contracting market. That sort of, desire to paddle your own canoe and do your own thing lends itself very well to freelancing. But it's always been that hybrid space, hasn't it? It does straddle a middle ground between traditional employment and, the type of self-employment that your tradespeople might have for certain examples. But no, it's interesting just coming back to that view on business risk, and I think Nick was exactly right to point it out as a major factor. The risk that contractors are seeing from IR35, ironically, it used to be the tax burden. But even in those days, that tax burden wasn't as bigger of a concern as the current approach to IR35 is. The macro effect that the changes to IR35 have had on that market are far bigger issues for the contractors than the actual tax burden itself, which lends itself to your point, Randy. It's not always that tax position and the tax efficiencies of self-employment that's driving people that way.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I think, that IR35, you often heard it being called a sword of Damocles, which was hanging over contractors' heads for all that time. But because it was an issue that contractors had to face and deal with, they became quite well versed in the legislation and the rules. They knew how to knew what what steps to take, what steps to avoid, and they just got to the point of being able to manage it. And
absolutely,
obviously now it's shifted.
And I think one of the bigger concerns is the longer term impact, both in the contracting space, but also extends into the wider self-employment space. How things like IR35 reform, long-term effects of Brexit, cost of living crisis, the threat of recession actually impacts people's appetite to actually want to stay in self-employment as well. And that's a really big concern. If you think about it, there are over 4 million self-employed people in the UK. There are probably something like 2 million odd people who kind of fall into that freelancer type category. And of the people that we surveyed, a concerning amount of people were actually questioning whether they wanted to continue in self-employment in 2024. And that's a worry.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Obviously, the tax incentives to be self-employed through a personal service company is significantly lower than they were 5-7 years ago. But factor that in alongside cost of living crisis and the importance of job security in this type of financial environment. Then it's sort of that two factors combining to really make that contracting position to some less attractive than it was a while ago. So I think it's as we've touched on, a recovering position, but I think there's still some way to go to give contractors that additional comfort as well. Something else that I found quite interesting in the survey was that we asked the question about how contractors have sourced work, how they've found contracts, which I think historically you would have expected recruiters to be top of the list from that perspective, but actually the highest proportion was word of mouth or referrals. So 43.2% of respondents said that they found their work from referrals, presumably from other contractors. Almost twice as many who'd cited recruiters as the main reason for it. But I think, taking a maybe a slightly cynical view, but it's also a positive take on it as well, is that actually I think a lot of that's down to creativity within the recruitment space. I think the value of how people view a personal referral like that or a personal recommendation is worlds apart from that sort of cold lead of just responding to a job advert. And I think agencies are very very wise to that, and they've changed their approach to, incentivise referrals or introduce roles via people already in place in roles. And, that's a natural progression within that industry. But the recruitment space in and of itself is inherently innovative. They have to be nimble and be able to react to different behaviours of both hirers and potential workforce. And I think that would probably be one of the reasons why that word of mouth point has scored so highly with us.
Yeah.
I think as well it's quite symptomatic of the point that I made earlier in terms of the skills shortage. So if you're a client and you've got this kind of key, really big, important project within the organisation, it's natural that you might look to the expertise that you've already got there and thinking, right, well, I've got a community of project managers, I've got a community of programme directors, I've got a community of BAs from a technology perspective. You will know. So if you're in that space and you've been contracting for however long, you've probably got a portfolio of ex-colleagues, friends, people that operate in that same space. And for a client in this sort of climate where there is a shortage and it's difficult to get the right type of talent, that you would look to the talented expert people that you've already got in the organisation who are kind of undertaking those contracts at the minute as a source to go and find that.
And do you think the growth in popularity of sort of an RPO model actually lends itself to that as well?
Yeah, potentially, because if organisations are perhaps looking to take more control over driving that talent acquisition strategy, leaning on the RPO to kind of undertake that more administrative, contractual, kind of admin type fulfillment, then that sort of all works in there together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it creates that sort of managed pool of wider resource that a business would want to rely on and trust, which all, again, lends itself into that personal connection and interpersonal referrals, which, is a big piece of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and, it is. I mean, if we look at the way in which we interact with contractors, the vast majority of our business comes from word of mouth.
Yep.
Which shows that there is a community.
Yes.
Yeah.
There is a strong community there.
Yeah.
And obviously that that works from a recruitment perspective as well. 18.9% LinkedIn, probably lower than I thought actually.
I guess there's a bit of crossover there with
the recruiters and
recruiters. So I think pure LinkedIn would probably be lower than the 18.9%, but it's actually a tool that's used by others to herd people in the direction.
And I think that's it. Like LinkedIn's used by contractors themselves looking for work, recruiters trying to identify contractors, clients looking to fill roles. So you do get that kind of real mix of this kind of ecosystem of people searching for work, looking for people to undertake the work. So it's a kind of perfect storm of. But you're right. I actually thought LinkedIn would probably have been a bit higher. So that's an interesting one. Yeah.
We mentioned umbrella companies. We touched on that earlier. That obviously is been a feature for a lot of contractors' lives over the past few years in terms of the need to use an umbrella company. Obviously, there are other matters at play in terms of the potential regulation of the umbrella sector.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't think this is particularly surprising. We asked. Whether people who have used umbrella companies did so either out of choice or having been mandated to use them, and unsurprisingly, I think 89% of respondents said that they were effectively forced to use an umbrella company.
I think it's important probably to point out there, though, that is being forced to use an umbrella company rather than mandating a particular umbrella company. I think most reputable agencies will understand that freedom of choice in which umbrella company a particular worker uses, or a degree of freedom of choice, is a very important part of compliance.
So do you think, in terms of that choice, obviously historically we heard a lot about PSLs and agencies having a list of 3, 4, 5 umbrella companies that contractors could use. Do you think that's still the case? Do you think it's moved a little bit?
Yeah, I think agencies do have a certain degree of flexibility over that. I think it does really come down to that compliance point. Obviously, an agency can't be seen to be pushing umbrella workers towards umbrella companies that aren't reputable, or potentially supporting non-compliant tax structures, which is still a factor. And it's entirely possible for agencies to get caught out there. So there's sort of a change in the industry around compliance, particularly with an eye on umbrella companies. There are a lot of reputable firms out there that now carry out checks on umbrella companies to make sure that there's nothing untoward going on there. But I think, understandably, to a certain extent, agencies have to distance themselves from that choice from the contractor. There is a potential for umbrella companies to be picking up liability through poor umbrella company structures or non-compliant umbrella company structures, so they need to have an eye on that. So that PSL point will always underpin anything. But equally, if you just think about it from a pragmatic point of view, if one of us were looking for a job and it was on a temporary basis and we were told it needed to be via an umbrella company, obviously we've got industry background knowledge and could source one from that side. But for most people, that's just a completely out of the box suggestion, and they wouldn't know where to start.
Yeah, I think especially as well because the landslide into umbrella ways of working for such a big chunk of the population who otherwise had never worked like that before post-reform, or pre-reform I should say, there is definitely a bit of that, but I think there is still across the board, both in agency supply chains and within the client supply chain as well, concern and hesitancy around this full end-to-end supply chain financial compliance. Obviously the umbrella consultation seeks to address large chunks of that in terms of the risk and the appetite of agencies, the risk and appetite of a client, what good due diligence looks like, who should undertake that due diligence. But even as where we are today, with the fact that we have the Criminal Finances Act and CCO that came in 2017, there is a risk and exposure to the other parties in the supply chain. So agencies who have a PSL, they can say that they have vetted, that they have undertaken appropriate due diligence. And like you say, you still give contractors a choice, but it's a choice through, well, actually, these have gone through a form of either internal vetting process, they're kind of certified by a independent party out there in the market. But it's understandable for clients and agencies to want to have controls because of the wider risks that actually exist in that umbrella space as well.
And there's such limited understanding of what those risks are. There's some really complex points of both tax and law that apply to that regulation. And to be fair, so much of it is untested as well. So it's very hard to sort of trust the approach of any organisation. So it is an interesting time, and there will be, and we're fully expecting changes to the regulation and compliance of umbrella companies, but there are still poor examples out there. Ones that facilitate offshore arrangements, which ultimately leave workers and hirers and agencies exposed alike. So it's important to make sure.
It's amazing. It's amazing that there are still bad practices out there. It's amazing that there are still people who really target the contractor industry, the contractor freelancer industry, when it comes to tax avoidance schemes.
But you look at the headline figures. If someone can offer you an extra 16% take home, then you're probably going to treat it with a little bit of suspicion. But if someone says they've got a mechanism that allows you to take 5% more, and it's widely used and it's got all the right logos and badges on the site, you can sort of see how a consumer would fall for that. It doesn't necessarily surprise me that there are still some nefarious operators out there. But it is, in a state of flux at the moment.
Yeah.
So I one of the major themes this year is going to be in the political arena. Naturally, we're heading towards a general election, and clearly that would that form part of our questioning when we put the survey out. So some interesting results.
Yeah.
Well, we can pretty much close the election at this point, can't we? Labour almost twice as many votes as the Conservatives, and then
you say that, but one of the most interesting points was the fact that we asked what political party represents contractors and freelancers' best interests, and actually Conservatives came out higher than the other political parties, though. How would you explain that?
Well, I would look slightly above that in the survey, and over 60% said none of them. So that's probably the key point. And I also wonder whether there is a little bit of sort of residual views on the change to IR35 and the stop of the repeal, and the fact that there was an attention paid to it by the Conservatives maybe suggests that would be the case. But then equally, Labour Party's the party of higher taxes traditionally, which might also factor into it as well.
And also the party who first brought in IR35 legislation in the first place. And I think that's it. Like politically, if you think about IR35 and the changes that we've gone through in the last, terrifyingly, now 24 years, there has been this sort of political roller coaster and we've talked about this before in terms of IR35 being a political hot potato, but it has been used in self-employment and people kind of working for themselves is often used as this kind of bit of a political baton in terms of, especially in election years. And obviously we've gone through this kind of couple of years of quite a lot of uncertainty in the political landscape, that we had one party who brought in the original legislation. We then had another party who sought the reform in the public sector. The same party then sought reform in the private sector. The same party then sought a repeal for a very short period of time. So I can understand why actually most contractors are of the view none of these people represent what I actually do in the best possible way, because and amongst that you've got other changes like changes to dividend tax, we've got discussions around changes to VAT, changes to corporation tax. So all of these things then sort of come back to your micro businesses, your freelancers, your contractors, and I'm thinking, well, actually, Westminster and the people that sit within the House don't actually have my best interests at heart, because no one's been able to demonstrate that they are really there to represent the challenges of the individual self-employed worker.
Do we think that actually maybe that label from a political perspective of self-employed is far too broad? Is it the case that actually there's multiple different types of self-employed engagement, and actually coming together with a set of rules that apply to all self-employed arrangements just isn't feasible?
Well, yeah, I think that's the tricky thing as well, because obviously Labour has a bit on their kind of agenda around kind of the banishment of zero hours contracts and whatnot. But if you think about a contractor, technically they have the 0 hours contract, but contractors don't necessarily want all of the same rights as employed people. And it's a really, really complex subject to kind of detach. But I think that you're right when you think about self-employment as a whole. At one end of the spectrum, you have your freelance, your side hustles, your self-employed kind of hobbyists, through to gig workers, through to your more traditional and conventional contractors. There is a real broad spectrum, and the wants and needs of all of those people aren't the same.
No, 100%.
And I suppose, the risk is that by applying a concept or a rule to all is going to, it's the classic case of a sledgehammer cracking a nut, isn't it? It's going to have ramifications which actually could, and I know there is some concern at the moment about the things that Labour are saying. That there is some concern amongst contractors that potentially they could end up in a position where they are,
And I think that's an important question that's being missed, though, isn't it? What is a fair outcome for contractors? I mean, ultimately, they are giving up certain employment rights and the benefits that you would expect from, traditional employment. But equally, it's probably fair to say that they're not taking on the same level of risks and exposures that a traditionally self-employed person would have. Someone who's out having to win 5 or 6 new clients a week to provide a fixed service in the way that a plumber or an electrician would operate. There is a middle ground there, and I don't think there's ever been an open discussion around what is a fair tax position for those workers to be in. Clearly, there should be a quid pro quo around the fact that they're giving up employment rights, and lower tax is a sensible way to address that. But equally, I think most people would suggest that the level of tax breaks that we had probably 10 years ago now, before the changes in dividend tax and corporation tax changed things, that was probably too far the other way. And I think that was part of the motivation for the IR35 reforms, when actually I think the question could be pared back a little bit. A decision made about what would be an appropriate level of tax for those workers, and then looking at how to police it, which, I don't think has been done.
No.
Yeah, and I think the challenge for any political party, or all political parties, I should say, is the world of work as it is today, in terms of where we've been over the last 4 or 5 years, Brexit, COVID, all of these things, has changed the way of working substantially. And that evolution around kind of being a kind of portfolio contractor, more the increase or the expectation that the amount of people who are self-employed, who have multiple jobs, is set to increase, is whatever support mechanisms, the tax mechanisms, the kind of the rights mechanisms that are introduced need to be reflective of the fact that the world is very different today. We're kind of growing in a completely different direction to where we've been for the last 30 years in terms of, like, when my parents went into job, like, you went into somewhere and you worked there for 30 years and that was kind of it. That is for anyone who is coming into the world of work, people who are at high school, people who are at university, that doesn't exist anymore. Like that concept of working for one organisation for the rest of your life, and that kind of idea needs to really come through in what these political parties are intending to promise the 4 million self-employed people in the UK.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they aren't going to get votes, and no one is going to support them and think that they actually have their best interests at heart.
Yeah, exactly. You would think there's a lot of ground for parties to win at the moment because they have been relatively silent on this. I mean, as you alluded to earlier, we did ask who contractors plan to vote for. As you suggested, Labour have come out on top. It's not a landslide. 23.9% to 14.8%, a big, a big increase.
I think it's all those secretive Conservative voters, though. That's the problem. They're not going to advertise the fact that they're voting Conservative, which is why it's only 14.8%.
Yeah. So, but it certainly looks like Labour are in the kind of odds on at the moment. Certainly from a contractor's perspective. We also asked what the new government should prioritise.
Yep.
And again, IR35.
Surprisingly.
Maybe a little self-interested from the people who replied there, but won't disagree with that.
It was 67.6% of people thought that IR35 should be repealed.
What do we actually think? Like, realistically speaking, because we've talked about this a lot over the last few years. We talked about it before reform. We've talked about it since reform. We had that really odd period in 2022 where it was maybe potentially going to be a reality. But realistically speaking, would IR35, a repeal of IR35 reform, ever be a contender for any political party in a new term?
I mean, what does a repeal look like at this point?
That's it.
That is the difficult thing. I mean, a repeal of IR35, we're going all the way back to 1999.
Exactly.
And having, complete about turn. No, I think for me it falls into the need for review at every level. So it's a case of one of the changes that was brought about with the off payroll working, one of the key ones was making the engager and the fee payer in the agency if applicable responsible for the tax position. Seems eminently sensible that there should be a degree of that, but then to completely remove the contractor's responsibility seems a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah.
So I think recognition that the current version isn't right is the first step, but then how you address that is a different question.
Yeah, I can't see any. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we did have as we said, that period where the repeal was announced, and that almost makes you feel like anything's possible. Anything could happen in that regard. But I think clearly we had so much risk aversion when it came to the reform. There was a huge impact with all the financial institutions effectively saying they weren't going to engage contractors. That had a massive impact on the whole contractor market, in addition to COVID as well. But as time goes on, businesses are getting to grips with their responsibilities. Slowly, it's happening slowly. But if we look at the fact that 3/4 of people did secure an outside I-35 role, the more the more time that passes, the more people are getting to understand how to how to meet their obligations, and actually then making any significant announcement could have the opposite impact. It could create more confusion.
But then I think we need to scrutinise what the government's intention were around the reforms. Was it to actually position the hiring organisations and the agencies in the line of fire for tax purposes so that they can reclaim? Or was it to change the behaviour of the market and push more people towards employment and full tax positions rather than self-employment? Again, the cynic in me says it was the latter. It was a success from that perspective. So now that businesses are, to your point, getting their heads around the legislation, learning to work around it, those advantages that the government had are actually diminished. So on that basis, is reform needed to rebuild the coffers off the back of people getting to grips with the new set of tax rules?
Yeah. So your question was, what do we predict?
Yeah.
What do you predict? What do you think will happen?
I don't like answering these questions.
So let's say Labour come in. And do you think anything will happen prior to the general election? Firstly,
I don't think anything will happen prior to the general election. I think the March budget is going to be kind of pretty vanilla and straightforward from a contractor perspective. I don't think there's going to be much in there beyond obviously the technical points around the changes to the offset rules that exist within the Chapter 10 part of the legislation. I don't know that any political party would kind of set their stall out to say, right, we're going to do this specifically on IR35. I think that we've maybe come full circle on that specific point being used, but like we talked about in terms of like Labour have been pretty clear on their intentions from a general employment rights, self-employment, all this kind of thing. I would hope, the optimist in me is that whichever kind of party comes in, whoever our Prime Minister is, whoever our Chancellor is, sees that there is work to be done with IR35 and self-employment and taxes and employment rights across the board, and really thinks about how best that they can look to solve that. I don't know that it would be something specific from an IR35 perspective, unfortunately.
Any counter to that, or do you?
No counter. Pretty much full agreement.
Yeah.
I don't think there will be a significant movement in it, but I think the positive step that could be taken is a more sort of holistic view. Sort of as Nick's alluded to there as well, which, I think is the type of empty and broad promise any political party is going to make before a general election. So we'll probably be sat here a year from now wondering what the implementation of the new government will be around that. And ultimately the outcome may be a very costly think tank type organisation funded by taxpayers to review the current situation and advise on minimal changes and then not actually implement a huge amount of them. But again, that's the cynic in me. So
it's not like we don't have a couple of reports and reviews that we can point to that says that they've kind of done that before. There's a few of them, which is not massively reassuring. But there you go.
And how about you?
Yeah, I've just learnt not to be surprised by anything. Really. I mean, I think there is I'm surprised that neither political party, particularly Labour, have really capitalised on the passion that people have around I-35 reform in particular. Obviously, we've seen some Conservative backbenchers who have kind of made reference to I-35. They've kind of apparently been putting some pressure on their colleagues in terms of looking to repeal the rules. But I am kind of surprised that we haven't seen anything more concrete. But I think, like we've said before, it is unlikely. We're unlikely to end up in a position at this stage where it's going to be any worse for contractors. Yeah.
I think what the last couple of years has taught of it is, like you said, is not to be surprised in the fact that where there is a lot of kind of political uncertainty, fiscal uncertainty, that the leaders of the country and legislators and reforms can take any kind of manner or shape. So I think that, like you say, we might not be surprised, but who knows? Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe there's one. I've got one final statistic here, which is a nice positive statistic to say, is that we also surveyed engagers of contractors as part of this process as well. And 82% of engagers felt contractors were either critical or important for their business. Which is quite nice, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I think contingent labour for all types of businesses is a significant thing to be focusing on. Of course, it's very difficult for an organisation to manage an employment-only engagement model for workers. I'd be surprised if we had any other view on it, in all honesty.
And I think that you've got to take from that as organisations see the criticality of workers, that continues to kind of really help bring home that point around, right, well, actually, how best can we engage these workers? How do we get access to the right talent? How do we better ourselves operationally? How do we get ahead of our competitors? What's the compliance position? And actually think, right, well, actually, is there another way of us doing this, especially for those who've kind of taken that more blanket position around, right, well, we're not going to engage contractors as a policy.
I think even within those organisations, though, there'd be a recognition that they're engaging the same types of people just via different models. They need the flexibility that the contingent workforce gives them, and the fact that they have to do it through an umbrella company at a higher cost, less flexibility around that is a negative. But actually, that engagement of workers on a temporary or contract basis is still fundamental to a lot of how businesses run.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Just thinking about the survey results and the round then, what's like your biggest takeaway from the survey?
I think my biggest takeaway is that there is positivity there. There is, despite the fact that there have been And I can completely appreciate why contractors, in some instances will feel like there's no hope. They've been they've had to use umbrella companies. There's obviously the market conditions in some areas are pretty difficult at the moment. So I can see why there could be some negativity, or contractors feeling like there isn't a future for contracting. But I think the results here suggest otherwise.
Yeah, and I think the thing that always stands out to me whenever we do this type of exercise is the level of sound understanding that workers have over what's actually quite a complex piece of tax legislation. Always astounds me. How poorly I get to grips with my own tax return. These guys have got a far more complex job. The fact that there is that level of knowledge out there is impressive.
Yeah.
How about you?
I think that it's the optimism that kind of came from it, and that we know that we've gone through the last few years, generally speaking, have been challenging for everyone. And I think that there is that shift in being able to get contracts on an outside of IR35 basis. There is the confidence around kind of the prospect of business success for contractors going into 2024. And yes, we're not glossing over the challenges that IR35 reform continues to represent, or the uncertainty around the political landscape, or the kind of financial crisis that we're sort of in the midst of. I think despite all of those things, there is a real sense of optimism in it. So I think that's kind of my biggest takeaway. And obviously, from our point of view, it's doing as much as we can to continue to promote that really positive message and make sure that there's the right type of good press and representation around the contracting market and the contracting community as a whole.
Yeah. Okay, I think with that we'll leave it there. Unless you've got any other points to make.
No, all good.
No, just look out for more surveys, I guess. It's so much fun.
So thanks for watching or listening. Please subscribe to our socials, and you can get immediate updates on more episodes, and obviously all of the latest news too. And we'll be back soon with more guest episodes and so on. So we'll see you next time.